April 28, 1945, at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France. The air is thick with the scent of map paper and impending victory, but the atmosphere snaps when an uncomfortable aide interrupts Eisenhower with an urgent, secure line from Patton. The hook is the sheer, world-altering audacity of the request. Patton wants to ignore the Red Army's presence and launch an American assault on Berlin within 48 hours. Eisenhower's immediate, hardened refusal, reminding Patton that we are not starting a conflict with our Soviet allies, sets the stage for a story about one man's attempt to rewrite the peace before the war has even ended. Before we continue our story, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe button, and really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. By January 1945, the relentless machinery of the Third Army had ground its way into Poland, but the atmosphere among the high command had shifted from the heat of battle to a chilling uncertainty. General George S. Patton, ever the Hawk, dispatched a liaison team to coordinate boundaries with the approaching Red Army, expecting the professional courtesy of a fellow liberator. Instead, his officers returned with hollow eyes and stories that defied the Ally label. The reports were staggering. Soviet commanders were not merely suspicious. They were openly hostile, treating American uniforms with the same cold contempt they reserved for the enemy. More haunting was the testimony regarding the treatment of civilians. Patton's men witnessed systematic, organized pillaging, a scorched earth policy of looting and assault that the Soviet high command dismissed as the just spoils for 20 million Russian dead. Patton listened in a heavy, brooding silence, the gears of his mind turning. He realized then that the liberation of the East was a convenient fiction. The Soviets weren't just winning a war, they were conquering an empire. The first cracks in the Grand Alliance had formed, and for Patton, the next war had already begun. By April 1945, the Third Army was racing across a shattered Germany, their momentum carrying them toward the borders of Czechoslovakia. Patton, sensing a closing window of opportunity, reached out to Eisenhower with a plea that was less of a suggestion and more of a demand. Let him liberate Prague. The city sat undefended by the Germans and was begging for American intervention to avoid Soviet occupation. But Eisenhower's response was a brick wall. Prague was in the Soviet zone of occupation, and the agreements made at Yalta were sacrosanct. Patton's fury boiled over. To him, agreements with Stalin were worthless pieces of paper, and by halting, the Allies were winning the war only to lose the peace. When intelligence later reported that Third Army units had accidentally crossed the demarcation line under the guise of aggressive reconnaissance, the tension reached a breaking point. Eisenhower issued a chilling ultimatum: pull back immediately or face relief from command. Patton finally blinked, retreating with a cold warning that Eisenhower would eventually regret turning Prague into another Soviet slave state. The rift between the two men was no longer just professional. It had become a fundamental clash over the future of the world. On April 25, 1945, the world watched as American and Soviet forces finally linked up at the Elbe River. To the global public, it was a moment of supreme triumph. Allies shaking hands over the carcass of the Third Reich. Patton attended the official ceremony, playing the part of the victorious general, smiling for the flashbulbs and raising toasts to joint success. But behind the polished brass and diplomatic grins, his disgust was visceral. He looked at the Soviet commanders and saw not partners in peace, but wolves in allies' clothing. The tension nearly cracked the facade during an informal dinner. When a Soviet general toasted their shared victory over fascism, Patton couldn't help but retort that fascism had merely changed flags. His aide, sensing a diplomatic disaster, kicked him under the table and signaled the translator to sanitize the remark into a generic compliment. Patton allowed the lie to stand, but his private conviction was unshakable. He believed the West was celebrating a transition from one tyranny to another, and as he watched the Red Army celebrate, he knew the handshake at the Elbe was the beginning of a long, cold shadow. The fragile peace between the Allies nearly shattered in a dusty field near Leipzig. On May 1st, 1945, a Third Army reconnaissance patrol encountered a group of Soviet soldiers who were deep in a drunken celebration of the impending German collapse. The encounter soured instantly when the Soviets demanded the Americans hand over their supplies at gunpoint. Following Patton's unspoken doctrine of refusing to be intimidated by so-called allies, the American lieutenant drew his own sidearm, refusing to back down. For 30 agonizing seconds, the world balanced on the edge of a knife as soldiers from both nations leveled weapons at one another, one nervous trigger pull away from igniting a third world war. Although a senior Soviet officer eventually arrived to defuse the standoff, the damage was done. When a report reached Eisenhower, he was livid, accusing Patton of being one stupid mistake away from a catastrophe. Patton remained defiant, arguing that if the West did not stand up to the Soviets now, they would only be forced to fight them later at a far greater cost. The incident served as a chilling preview of the Cold War to come. The atmosphere on May 8, 1945, was one of unparalleled jubilation as the world celebrated VE Day. Yet, for Patton, the official end of the war in Europe felt like a strategic funeral. Forced to attend a major press conference, he stood before a room of reporters who expected platitudes about Allied unity. When asked about the Soviet allies, the room went cold as Patton's restraint finally snapped. He declared that the Soviets were behaving not like partners, but like conquerors interested only in building an empire. He went further, crossing a line no active general was permitted to tread. He suggested that the United States had defeated the wrong enemy and warned that conflict with the Soviet Union was an inevitability. He argued that America should face them now while the military was at full strength, rather than waiting for them to consolidate control over broken Europe. His staff watched in horror as his honesty became an international scandal within hours. Headlines across the globe screamed that a top American general was advocating for World War III. For Eisenhower, this was the final act of insubordination. Patton's military career was now on the clock. On May 9, 1945, the day after the world erupted in celebration, Patton stood in the silent, suffocating air of Eisenhower's headquarters. There was no seat offered, no congratulatory handshake for the man who had led the Third Army across the heart of Europe. Eisenhower's fury was cold and absolute. The wrong enemy speech had become a diplomatic wildfire that threatened the fragile peace with Stalin. In a room heavy with the weight of political necessity, Eisenhower delivered the blow Patton feared most. He was being stripped of his command. The legendary Third Army was taken from him, replaced by the 15th Army, a paper army, existing primarily for administrative history and occupation oversight. Patton's face went white as he realized he was being sidelined, silenced by the very superiors he had served with such ferocity. Eisenhower was clear. He was choosing a stable, political peace over Patton's aggressive military warnings. To Patton, it was a betrayal of the millions liberated from the Nazis only to be handed to the Soviets. He left the room a general without a mission, exiled to a desk in Bavaria while the Iron Curtain he had predicted began to descend. The winter of 1945 brought a cold, administrative end to Patton's martial glory. Reassigned to the 15th Army in Bad Nauheim, he spent his days overseeing a paper army and drafting a history of the European campaign he had once led with fire. On December 9, 1945, near Mannheim, Germany, the man who had survived the lead and iron of 2 world wars met his end in a mundane traffic collision. A truck turned into the path of a staff car, and though the impact was minor, Patton was thrown forward, sustaining a severe spinal injury that left him paralyzed from the neck down. As he lay dying in a Heidelberg hospital, Eisenhower visited him for a final, somber meeting. The room was stripped of the shouting matches and political posturing of the previous months. Patton, weak but clear-eyed, told Eisenhower one last time that the West had defeated the wrong enemy and would pay for helping the Soviets become powerful. Eisenhower admitted that Patton's concerns were valid, though he still maintained that the general's methods had been impossible. 12 days later, on December 21st, Patton passed away, leaving behind a haunting final prophecy. My problem was that I saw the future and nobody believed me. Only 2 years after Patton was laid to rest, the world he feared became a grim reality. The Iron Curtain descended across Europe exactly as he had predicted, as Soviet expansionism swallowed Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia into a new era of tyranny. Eisenhower, now serving as the Army Chief of Staff, watched the reports of Soviet aggression with a growing, heavy sense of unease. He was forced to admit to his inner circle that the insane general had been right about everything. The West had indeed defeated one enemy, only to empower a more formidable one. Decades later, historians continue to debate Patton's final months, caught between his brilliant strategic foresight and his impossible political demands. While his solutions might have been a logistical and political nightmare for a war-weary America in 1945, his diagnosis of the coming Cold War was remarkably accurate. History has partially vindicated the madman of the Third Army. Patton's tragedy was not that he was wrong, but that he saw the future too clearly for a world that was desperate to believe the fighting was finally over. Patton was willing to risk it all to stop the next war before it started. Was his request a stroke of genius or a recipe for disaster? Subscribe now to explore more of the secret history that could have changed the world forever.